Very good morning to everybody. And we'll just leave it a few seconds just to let for people to come into the session. Leave it a few seconds more. Okay. Okay, a very good morning to everybody. I'm Steve, and we're here to go through the results of the 2025 RECOUP UK Household Plastic Packaging Collection Survey. So we've got an hour schedule, but we wanted to make it short and punchy. So it's likely to last between half an hour and 45 minutes, I think, this morning. So as background, the collection survey is an annual research-based report providing a comprehensive review of the household plastic packagings collected for recycling in the UK, and also the opportunities and also the barriers facing local authorities as well. The main findings will be outlined by my esteemed colleagues, Laura and Veronica. Laura is a projects and data specialist, and she's got 10 years experience of delivering insight-driven analysis across a range of industries, and she's been working on the survey now for 5 years. She holds a degree in geology and geography, underpinning a strong environmental background. Veronica has contributed to many recycling projects since joining RECOUP a couple of years ago. She's got a strong background in project management, and she's played a very active role in the last 2 survey reports. We're also very delighted to be joined by Gareth Rollings to provide an insight from a local authority perspective. Gareth is an experienced public sector leader and chartered waste manager with 20 years experience in waste recycling and environmental services. As head of waste at West Sussex County Council, he leads strategic planning, major contracts and service innovation. Gareth is actually appointed chair of LARAC this year, and he provides one informed local authority voice to government. He also sits on the RECOUP board, and we're very, very grateful to have him with us to help guide our work and activities. Next slide, please, Laura. Just a few words about RECOUP. We were actually founded in 1990, and we are the UK's leading independent authority on recycling and plastics resource efficiency. So we're a registered charity, and our work is supported by around 180 members who share our commitments. So collaboration is key to everything we do. So our members are made up of brands, retailers, waste management providers, polymer producers, plastic packaging manufacturers, local authorities, compliance schemes, academia, and everyone else in between. So the idea is everyone comes together, we can share experiences, learnings across different sectors for the greater good. Next slide, please. So our activities are quite varied, and it's important to note we actually cover packaging and non-packaging. Sometimes non-packaging is pushed to the sides, but actually it's still very much the centre point of our activities. Policy and legislation is key, consumer education, plastics in the environment, litter, fly tipping, waste crime, recyclability trials and testing, also life cycle analysis and reuse are all central to our work. We also produce a range of reports. The survey collection survey is one of them, plus case studies and various other research areas that are of interest to the industry as well. Just moving on from that, we have a series of, sorry, we've got some information that you can put into the chat at any point, but also if you've got specific questions, you can actually put them into the Q&A. We've got in that chat, we've actually got a couple of questions we'd like to ask about the next year's survey. There's some interesting changes we'd like to make, and if you've got any sort of insight, data or information you'd like to see in the next survey, just pop them into the chat. You can also send that to Laura as well. So I think, Laura, I think that's it from me now. So you just got to pass across to yourself to take it from there. Thank you very much.
As every year in May, we sent out a questionnaire to all 361 local authorities across England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, as well as county councils and waste partnerships. The survey covered a broad range of topics, so from tonnages collected and material reject rates, through to more anecdotal and qualitative insights, such as local authority views on policy changes and alternative packaging types. We'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the 70% for collection authorities who took their time to respond this year. We really value the input and insight you've provided. Alongside the survey, RECOUP team also reviewed every local authority website to better understand the messaging being communicated to residents about their recycling services. This included looking at what materials are accepted at curbside, the types of recycling receptacles used, collection frequencies, and any specific instructions given to residents. In terms of the data analysis, we've used a consistent methodology with previous years when calculating total collection tonnages for each plastic format. Where possible, we've relied on actual responses from local authorities. Any gaps in the data set were then filled based on known service provision, applying estimated collection quantities. These were calculated either by adjusting previous survey responses or by using the number of households and applying the average expected collection rate per household. To be able to measure how local authorities are performing and to calculate the overall UK collection rates, we first needed a placed on the market figure for consumer packaging. Historically, we have used Valpak plastic flow and pack flow reports to arrive at this number. However, the 2025 survey saw a variety of added complexities when calculating this figure, such as ongoing economic pressures and shifts in consumer behaviour. Additional data has become available through producer reporting requirements under packaging extended producer responsibility, with 2024 calendar year data seeing the majority of initial teething complications being resolved, increasing its robustness and reliability. Therefore, 2024 consumer plastic packaging placed on the market data reported in 2025 survey was taken from the figures now available on the National Packaging Waste Database through PEPR reporting, with additional reported data from other sources such as Valpak utilised to calculate nation and format splits. Overall, 1,450,000 tonnes of household plastic packaging was placed on the market in the UK in 2024. Of this, 623.5 tonnes were plastic bottles, 406,000 tonnes were plastic pot stubs and trays, and 420,500 tonnes, 100,000 tonnes were plastic films and flexibles. We have also carried out, extensive discussions with industry experts, including packaging producers and compliance companies, to understand wider market observations and perspectives. The availability of the PEPR figures has meant that the 2024 placed on the market number is from a different source to that of 2023, where placed on the market was estimated to be 1,350,000. This difference has resulted in a notable increase in the placed on the market figure that should be taken into consideration when interpreting and comparing collection rates. When we look at the services local authorities are offering, the overall trends have remained largely consistent with what we've seen over the last few years. Plastic bottles continue to perform strongly, and there's still a 100% recycling provision rate, which has been in place since September 2019. Pot stubs and trays have once again increased, rising substantially from 89% in 2023 to 93% in 2024, likely due to pressures to include this material through the upcoming simple recycling legislation in England. But we've also seen progress for films and flexibles, with a 2% increase compared to last year, taking provision up to 16%. This is now the second consecutive increase following 6 years of decline. And it's worth noting that most of the local authorities newly accepting films and flexibles this year are based in England, which also suggests this uplift is already reflecting preparations for the mandatory collection of films and flexibles from 2027 under simple recycling. On the right-hand side, you can see a chart showing how service provision for each material has changed over the last decade. Overall, it's a positive upward trend, but it can also clearly see the highlights, the remaining potential and the significant volumes of material that are still not being captured because they aren't yet targeted for collection. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Veronica, and good morning all. So when it comes to the amount of household plastic collected through curbside schemes, this has increased steadily year on year since the curbside recycling was introduced across the UK in 2003. 2022 saw the first decline since our data collation began, but when you take into consideration the amount placed on the market over that same time period also decreased, the proportion collected for recycling actually remained the same. In total for 2024, 596,000 tonnes of plastic packaging was collected for recycling from our UK households, which continues the overall growth trend. And of this, 387,000 tonnes were plastic bottles, 178,000 tonnes plastic pots, tubs and trays, and 31,000 tonnes plastic films and flexibles. By combining the tonnage information from our local authorities with the updated placed on the market data, we're able to calculate the collection rates for each fraction. Overall, 41% of household plastic packaging in 2024 was collected for recycling. And this is actually a slight decrease on last year's 43%, which has been influenced by the increased place on the market figure that Veronica mentioned. However, over the last 5 years, the overall collection rate has actually remained quite static, ranging only 2% from 41 to 43, as you can see in the graph in the centre of this slide. The bottles and films fractions have also seen a slight year-on-year decrease in collection rate, with bottles dropping from 65 to 62 and films from 8 to 7%. However, pots, tubs and trays has increased from 40 to 44%. The amount of material collected per household can be seen in the graph on the right of the slide, and this shows that there's still a lot of potential for increasing the amount of plastic packaging collected through our curbside sources. And we expect legislation such as packaging EPR, simpler recycling, DRS, they'll all have an influence on these figures in the next few years. Every year, as part of our service provision website checks, RECOUP looks into the different ways in which local authorities are collecting their recycling at curbside. Just over 3/4 of our local authorities in the UK are using wheelie bins to collect their plastics for recycling, with the rest opting for bags, boxes or trolley boxes. The most popular colour of wheelie bin is still blue, with just under 1/3 of our local authorities choosing this colour. However, we still have 3% of local authorities using black bins to collect plastics for recycling, which is a colour more often associated with residual waste, and this is something to be mindful of if we're producing consumer communications that are going to be used nationwide. Fortnightly collections remains the most common frequency for collecting plastics for recycling at curbside, with 70% of local authorities collecting this often. 19% are choosing to collect once a week and 11% 3 or 4 weekly. It is important, however, to recognise that the container type we use and the type of collection service offered, be it commingled or source separated, can influence the frequency of collection. 54% of local authorities are choosing to collect their recyclable source separated, where at least one material type is collected separately from the other dry mix recyclables. However, due to the default requirement for paper and card to be collected separately from DMR under the simpler recycling legislation, we can expect to see the percentage increase for England for this over the next few years. And as it happens, Wales and Scotland already favour the source separated collection method, with 91% of local authorities in Wales and 84% in Scotland offering this. Although it's not directly mandated within the simpler recycling legislation, the method of collection, container types and frequency of collection may all indirectly be influenced as local authorities get to grips with the new requirements, such as food waste collections. When it comes to policy and legislation, it's safe to say the sector is going through significant change with a variety of reforms currently active or due to come into play over the next few years. I've put on the slide a selection of these, and I'm sure the majority of you are familiar with these. But for those that would like a little bit more detail, the survey report itself goes into more depth on these topics. In the context of findings from the results of this survey, the most significant insights were around simpler recycling in England and local authorities moving towards the requirements for households under this legislation. So simpler recycling legislation mandates that as of the 31st of March 26, local authorities are required to collect the recyclable waste streams of plastics, which includes cartons but excludes films, metals, glass, paper and card, and food waste from all households in England. Pots, tubs and trays are a format that are mandated to be collected in the plastics stream, and despite the 4% increase in the UK local authorities collecting this at curbside we saw, the survey also found that as of April 25, 8% of English local authorities were still not offering this service to their residents. And likewise, 29% of English local authorities were not collecting drinks cartons at curbside, with a further 10% not giving any guidance regarding cartons and their collections to their residents. When it comes to food waste, 41% of English local authorities were not offering collection at curbside. However, of these, we found the majority making it clear on their websites that they were aware that this requirement was needed and they were planning rollouts throughout 2026. A handful actually detailed permissions they'd received from DEFRA to delay their rollouts and advise their residents as such on their website. The collection of plastic films from households at curbside is mandated as of the 31st of March 2027. The 2025 survey saw an increase in local authorities collecting the films, as Veronica mentioned, rising from 14% to 16%. The majority of these additional local authorities were in England. However, there still remains some doubt in the logistics behind what happens to the films after it's collected, both within local authorities not currently offering curbside collections and those that are. And this was especially prevalent in their confidence around the availability of viable end markets, with 29% of those who have curbside collection schemes in place and 60% of those who don't having low confidence in this area. So the 2025 RECOUP survey found that of those local authorities in England who do not currently offer curbside collection of films, 2/3 are waiting until the Q1 2027 to implement one. 47% are expecting to launch exactly on the simpler recycling deadline, and 1 in 5 are not intending on introducing the service by the 31st of March 2027. However, this does mean that despite the doubts of logistics and end markets, 4 in 5 local authorities in England are still aiming to have their collection of plastic films in place by the deadline set out in the simpler recycling legislation. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Gareth Rollings from LARAC, who's going to talk to us about the impact of the report findings and the policy changes from a local authority's perspective.
I'm just coming, sorry, I just shared my screen and couldn't take myself off mute. I should be in now. Thank you very much for that introduction. I will try not to repeat any of the information said, but it's likely I'm going to cover a few items that were on your slides. So I'm Gareth Rollings, I'm the Head of Waste at West Sussex County Council and currently the Chair of LARAC. For those of you who don't know who LARAC is, we are the Local Authority Recycling Advisory Committee and we represent over 80% of local authorities in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So we have quite a big voice for our members on different types of issues. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to sit on the RECOUP board on behalf of LARAC, and there's some really good work going on. So I'm looking at the survey from a local authority perspective, and I think people would agree that this is a very comprehensive annual data set we receive on plastics collection in the UK, and I think the 70% response rate sort of shows the value from local authorities, because local authorities, we are not the best at responding to surveys, so a 70% return rate is very, very good. I think this year also it really matters this year because of all of the local authority changes that are happening with major reforms such as EPR, simpler recycling, plastic film collections and deposit return scheme, which will appear later on. I'm going to try and focus not on the survey itself, but what it tells us about the practical challenges opportunities and risks that are facing councils over the next few years. At a national level, the survey shows just under 600,000 tonnes of household plastic packaging was collected in 2024. That equates to an overall household plastic collection rate of 41%. For rigid plastics like bottles, pots, tubs and trays, collection sits at around 55%, but plastic film lags behind at around 7%. The key message here is that despite progress, the majority of plastic packaging is still not being captured, and capture remains the single biggest opportunity for improvement. The survey also shows clear variation across the 4 nations. Wales leads the way with 52% of household plastic collection rate, Northern Ireland at around 45%, with England and Scotland sitting in the low 40s. I don't think these differences are accidental. I think they reflect a long-term consistency in collection systems, with clearer resident communications and alignment between policy and service delivery. For those of you who live or work in Wales, for example, we know that the Wales system is a lot different to what we see across the other nations. And whilst it has more containers, what we are seeing from there is a much improved recycling rate than we have in the other nations in England. I think what it also does, it reinforces the importance of consistency and simplicity if we want to close this performance gap with the other nations. So looking at what councils currently collect, bottles are universal, we know that. Pots, tubs and trays are now collected by over 90% of authorities, which that is just such a big improvement. In West Sussex, we rolled out pots, tubs and trays relatively early. And the fact that now everyone else seems to have caught up with that, and the fact that 90% is really positive. I think the biggest one around the plastic film, we know that only around 16% of councils currently collect it. In terms of the methodology, we are sort of split between source separated and commingled systems. Personally, for me in West Sussex, I'm on a commingled service. It's, as a resident of West Sussex, it's all I've ever known. Everything in one bin, and when I say everything, it is all different types of recycling, and trying to move the mindset of residents from that one commingled service into a new sort of source separated one is not going to be an easy journey. One, I've got time to plan because the contract runs till 2033, so I've got some time to sort of bring that in now. I think with the reforms that are coming up, particularly the film collections, we're going to interact differently with different service designs, which is going to create sort of different levels of challenges and risk across different authorities, depending on sort of what their makeup of their residents are. So we know that plastic film is clearly the most challenging material in the system. I think it estimates that households consume around 15 kilograms per year, but only on average about 1 kilogram is currently being collected. So there's a lot of missed material there. I think we all know, and the survey shows this, that many councils lack confidence in the end markets, and over 1 in 5 authorities is not currently collecting film and are not planning to meet the 2027 deadline. I don't think this is resistance. I think it reflects sort of some real concerns around the cost and the infrastructure, and obviously at the end point of this, the certainty here about where material will go. So in some of the conversations that I've been having with DEFRA and government, in terms of how we collect this material, actually we could roll this out quite quickly. You give everyone a survival bag, collect it tomorrow. What we then come up with is, where do you store this material? Where do you then place it? And then where do you dispose of it? What we know from plastic film is that it's a highly combustible material. So, storing it in its own location is going to come with some real consequences in terms of that. But more importantly, the end market. And I think where we are as local authorities, if we were to collect that material and then store it or take it to sort of SRF, if that gets out into the public, that's a real negative story. So that becomes a really difficult message. And once residents are switched off, it's very difficult to switch them back on again. I think the survey also highlights ongoing issues with contamination. The average MRF rejection rate sits around 13%, with some authorities reporting levels much lower. My own one, sits at around 8 to 10%, depending on the time of year. We have in the past been as low as 4 or 5%. So we have seen more contamination now come through the system than we were seeing 5 or 6 years ago. But what this does represent is lost recycling, it's increased cost, and there is also a carbon impact on that material if you're receiving contamination. I think that contamination is often driven less by resident intent, but more by inconsistent messaging and unclear systems. If residents don't know how to interact with the service or know what to do, and I think one thing that needs to be right here for residents is the information needs to be easy. If you make it overly complicated, it switches them off from the start. And like I said earlier, it's very difficult to switch them back on. I think as new materials are added, especially films, getting the quality right will be important as increasing capture. What we are seeing now with rolled food waste out in West Sussex is we are seeing an uptake. We're able to put other messages along into the sort of on the leaflets around recycling as well, which should hopefully bring the recycling levels up. So we should have a situation where we're seeing less residual waste, we're seeing food waste, and we're actually seeing more recycling of the right material as well, because we've got such a big push that's going on across the county. Talking about communications, I think one of the biggest findings does relate to communications. As councils, we give very different advice on issues like lids on or off bottles, or whether recyclables should be loose. Over a third provide no guidance at all in some areas. What we do know is that at some point, simpler recycling will standardise materials, but it does not standardise that messaging. We have some very good, do some very good work with RAP, who obviously work on behalf of DEFRA, and they produce some really good materials that we, particularly at West Sussex County Council and the West Sussex Waste Partnership, who we represent, we make sure we use RAP on our waste sites, we make sure we use RAP on our leaflets, we make sure it appears on stickers, we use that branding, we have done for some time, and it's there and available and it's easy to use. So for me, it's like this, if you want to standardise something, you have an off the shelf product ready to go. Clear, consistent communication does remain a local responsibility, and I do think that most councils recognise this, with the majority are planning campaigns before 2026. Obviously, this survey was run last year, so you would hope that there's been a lot going on now with the food waste rollout. What this survey has done is it sits against a rapidly changing policy backdrop. So package and EPR will deliver significant funding to local authorities, but it also brings scrutiny on performance and outcomes. Simpler recycling sets some hard deadlines, so the plastic film deadline of 2027 is fast approaching. Personally, for me, we are doing some work on what that looks like. There's going to be a cost to that. There is no separate funding for it, apart from the fact that we try and use the EPR funding, but the way that's come through and not being ring-fenced has made that quite difficult for many local authorities who are facing some severe financial pressures. At the same time, we are going to see the deposit return scheme, which is expected to remove high-value materials from the curbside system, and the emissions trading costs will increase disposal costs going forward. So there's quite a lot of policies. These policies all interact with each other, so it's very difficult for councils to sort of plan for them in isolation. They all bounce off one another. So as soon as you sort of fix one problem, like we've brought food waste in, oh, okay, we're on to the next one now. How do we deal with that one? So when you're working in a local authority and these policies are moving at what I'd call pace now, it's very difficult to match that level of pace in your local authority with how you go through a governance process and getting decisions made. A lot of us are in election period now, which means actually council business isn't going to be done for a few months, so it makes it quite tough to get things moving. We know that financial pressures remain a dominant theme. I've just spoken about the council pressures. Some councils are in special measures, and some of the level of debt and that some of these councils have is eye-watering. A significant proportion of authorities have already experienced budget cuts, and more of us are expecting to see a reduction in the coming year. The PRN out income remains volatile, and recycling increasingly competes with energy from waste costs. Whilst PEPR will help, it does not eliminate the financial risk, and authorities will need to be strategic in using new funding to support long-term service resilience rather than short-term fixes. So this is how you look forward and try and plan for those long-term things, rather than just using a sort of a patch to try and fix issues that might be happening now, and actually not having an eye on what might be an unintended consequence of sort of what's been happening. I think when you bring all this together, a few clear implications emerge. Councils need to focus on capturing more material, particularly films, while improving quality and consistency. Confidence in end markets becomes central to service planning. Communication should be treated as a core infrastructure, not an add-on. I've been around long enough now to see where communication and recycling officers were switched off. That was the easy saving to take, but somewhere down the line you do see the impact of that, and it may not happen straight away, but it does happen in a few years. And in terms of data quality and performance, evidence will matter more than ever as policy oversight increases. Just finishing off to conclude, the system is changing quickly, but the survey shows that progress is possible. You've seen some of the plastic capture rates have greatly increased and gone up. The challenges facing councils are shared, they're not isolated, and evidence-based solutions are emerging. Success will depend on collaboration between authorities, contractors, producers and the government, and there's a lot of work going on in that arena at the moment. And I think for local authorities, the key message is to plan now, use evidence to guide your decisions and prepare for 2027, not as a single deadline, but as part of a wider system transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. That's really useful to get that insight. There's a few questions coming through from both in the chat and the Q&A. One from me actually. One of the things that really struck me was you said about the increase in contamination you've seen in your area. I mean, have you got any insight into why that might be?
So yeah, I mean, obviously we built a MRF in the early days and we didn't have as many materials in that stream, so we put glass in really quickly. So we've had glass from the start, but then we had added pots, tubs and trays, and it's then trying to make sure it is. We've always had this messaging where we sort of refer to it as clean, dry and loose. Clean your material, make sure it's kept loose, make sure it's dry. And I think it's just been, so I think the change has been, obviously we've seen the paper and card and newspapers and stuff have just reduced so much, so it starts bringing up other materials. And I think what we refer to it as lightweighting. So the system was built to deal with the material that was coming in at the time, and what's happened over that period is that obviously materials have changed so much that actually they start overwhelming the belts and stuff like that. There's also a lot of things we're seeing coming through now at MRFs. So if anyone here is running a MRF, vapes, small electricals, massive, frying pans, saucepans, gas canisters, oxide gas. There's all these new waste streams now. So, vapes didn't exist 10 years ago. Now they do. And all of that, when you add all that into the mix, and I think one of the things it's referred to is sort of almost that wish cycling. If I put it in the bin, it will get recycled. And so I think that just that pure mixture of so many more materials, and I think we all know what the system is like with electricals at the moment and how they're coming through the system. So I think that's probably what's driven it, and communications at local authorities. Unfortunately the waste collection authorities have had budget cuts and their communication comes down. So whilst you don't see it straight away, 2 years later, you've not been communicating with your residents. It's no surprise that they're going to start putting the wrong things in the bin.
Yeah, so there's material changes in terms of the packaging composition, but how we would probably want to wish cycle a frying pan is another matter. So there's only so much you can do to mitigate that, I guess. But yeah, from the MRFs I've seen, yeah, there's a significant amount of larger items coming through. And yeah, there's wish recycling, but there's careless recycling as well, of course, in that. So just to pick up on a couple of the points. Somebody said here, David said, the strikes in areas like Birmingham must have impacted on the recycling quantities. Laura, Veronica, I don't know if you've, in your analysis, whether you picked up on that at all, or is it just quite a small amount in the grand scheme of things and how it affects the overall figure?
I mean, obviously we look at the overall, so yes, things like strikes and things will have impacted certain local authorities, but in terms of the grand scheme, the big number, I would have thought, unless it's happening across multiple different local authorities, it wouldn't massively change our full number. But yeah, obviously things like that can have an influence.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And while we're on the yes, we've got another question here from Clover. Probably again one for Laura and for Veronica. Can you confirm if pots, tubs and trays figures still include the other fraction, or is it now just poor pots, tubs and trays? And just for context for everybody, this is about what's placed on the market. So when you look at plots placed in the market, it could be a bottle, it could be a pot, tub, a tray, or a film, but there's also an other fraction which doesn't necessarily fit into those other brackets very well. And that other fraction has actually increased in quantity over time as well. So it's always a challenge for us when we're putting place on the market figures together, how we attribute those smaller other items. I don't know if Laura, if you can remember that when you did the analysis.
Yeah, thinking about it. Because the place on the market figures have been taken from the PEPR data rather than the VALPAC data, if I remember rightly, the EPR data doesn't have something like other. It's set into categories such as drinks, non-drinks, and large producers, small producers. So I don't think that clear cut puts other. In terms of splitting that out, because that gives us the full number. When we split it out, yeah, we use other sources such as Valpac, but I believe we have just used the overall pots, tubs and trays percentage rather than including the other this year, because we had that other data from PEPR.
Yeah, thanks for that clarity. It's useful. Yeah, it's always been a challenge for us, and I know that particularly looking at plastic films and flexibles based on market, it's been a challenge for the last 2, 3, 4 years, and it continues to be as well. One comment from David was around about the drinks bottle collection rate, particularly as we've got the DRS coming in as well. You have to remind me, have we actually got a figure at the moment, or are we using historical figures? Because I think that's probably the case.
Not at the moment. We have previously in previous reports had some figures, but due to the complexity of calculating those numbers, we have not done that over the last couple of years. But it is something that has been raised from multiple people that will be of interest. And obviously, with, like we say, with DRS coming in, it is something that is going to be even more important and useful to have the data around going forward. So it is something for the next edition of our survey. We are looking into getting that data.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, for context, we're talking about PET drinks bottles. That's obviously in scope for a DRS. The natural HDPE milk bottles, there is not on the DRS. So, but they got a very high collection rates. I think from memory, the last one was around about 78% collection rate for that. So it's quite high.
If I remember rightly, we've been putting 70 to 80% as an overall kind of range for those. Yeah.
Good stuff. Right, into the chat. We've also got a comment here around flexibles and cartons are a really difficult issue for local authorities, as most MRFs still really don't want them as non-target contamination. So MRF readiness needs to be a priority. I mean, this keeps coming up all the time. I mean, and Gareth, from your point of view, both, I guess, from your own, in West Sussex, but also as the wider sort of representative for LARAC, what's your view on films and flexibles in cartons being involved? I know it's a huge question, but obviously there's the collection.
No, I'm happy to take
processing as well.
Flexibles and films are, I mean, it's so difficult because it's wide, in the membership, it's different in different authorities. So some have plastic films already, even though it's quite low. Some are starting to do it, and some of us are sort of looking at it. I think the concern is still there in terms of it's the end market. How on earth do you deal with that end market sort of perspective of actually getting rid of it? So the MRF in West Sussex is owned by us, is West Sussex. So we run that MRF for ourselves. It's not a commercial MRF. So any of the costs that come with dealing with flexibles come straight to the council. That we haven't got this commercial element to sort of like try and push some of the cost to other people, unlike a merchant MRF. So we are looking at the systems. We're estimating £500,000 of expenditure to put in place the system that will capture them. And what it will do is it will allow residents to place the plastic film in their recycling bin loose, and it will just be pulled out the system. Obviously, 2033, there's a bit of a changeover because the contract comes to an end. We've then got to look at how do we comply with simpler recycling, which says you should separate stuff when you've got a fully commingled MRF, but that's a way away yet for me not to worry about it. So we are doing that work, but I'm more nervous around once you've got it, where do you put it? Because it creates an awful lot of material that's being captured or created, and space being taken up, or volume, I guess is the word. But actually, when you squish it down, it doesn't become very much. And then you've got to store it somewhere. And I've sat with some conversations with government where we've been trying to sort of understand this, and they haven't. I think it's how do you stimulate that infrastructure works, because the one thing that we haven't seen over the last 10 years with waste is massive infrastructure projects. Sort of the waste companies aren't looking at spending lots and lots of money on the end waste disposal bit to treat this material. They're not being forced to take it in and do anything with it. So it's sort of leaving us with this material that we can't really do anything with. So I think at the moment it's from the LARAC exec and our members, I think it's sort of a mixed bag. Some are, some aren't. And then you come down to some of what it depends where you sit in the country. You know, if you sit in the middle of the country, you've got access to certain things. If you sit right down on the southeast or right up north in Scotland, or in the depths of Wales, you've got some real difficulty in getting to these facilities, and you end up spending a lot more on transport mileage, carbon footprint, dealing with it than you would do if you weren't collecting it. And so you then it goes off in so many different tangents and so many different arguments. It's very, very difficult to come out of. And I think the one thing we've sort of swayed away from at LARAC is trying to come back with a single voice going, this is terrible, this is good, this is, but because it's so different across the membership, and it's really hard to come up with sort of like an overall response on behalf of the whole membership without someone feeling alienated out of it by saying the wrong sort of thing. So I think we're keeping a bit of a watching brief on the plastics and the flexible plastics to see what is going to happen over the sort of next 6 months. But if you're personally, I'm not overly confident that there is this element of the can may be kicked down the road, but actually I'm not sure if kicking that can down the road will actually lead to any tangible output. It just feels like it just delays and just pushes it further down the road, and with no real response or no action taking place. So yeah, it's going to be a really difficult message to deal with, and a really difficult sell to local authorities.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think your point around the geographical locations is interesting as well. We can probably do a whole separate session on films and flexibles and cartons and how the impacts of that might play out. All I can say is that I've been dealing with looking at end markets for the Flex Collect project for 3 years. I've continued to work in that area, and there's some big developments happening in Europe, both for chemical recycling and some sorting facilities as well, which is quite interesting. There's also developments happening in the UK with some facilities being built. So there are shoots of hope, I think, in terms of looking at end markets long term, but it's going to take some time to develop those into a comprehensive coverage which can be used by most local authorities, I think. But okay, we've got to start somewhere, so we've got to get sort of the collections in place and build that sort of security up, that the resources are going to be there, materials going to be there. I think that's a starting point. But there's certainly a lot of more hope that I've seen the last 5-6 months, I think, than I have seen before, despite all the problems the reprocessors in the UK are going through. So as I say, I don't want to go into too much detail. We'll probably have a separate session on it, but thank you for your insight on that. In terms of just a question that's come to mind, Veronica, you've spent a lot of time doing material compositional analysis for the Flex Collect project. So going into the material, analysing it, seeing what's in there, so seeing what flexibles are in there, what non-flexibles are in there, what the contamination's like. What was your kind of overall observation from that material that you were going through? Sorry to put you on the spot, by the way.
No, that's fine. That's okay. I think it just varied bag by bag, to be honest. Some bags were worse than others in terms of contamination, but majority of the material was surprisingly quite clean. In terms of the material itself, and it was mainly PE, so bags, your plastic bags or freezer bags or that kind of the wrapping rather than PP. But overall, it was a clean material with not such big contamination as perhaps some people might expect. So that was a nice surprise when conducting the analysis.
Yeah, it was a lot cleaner than we thought, I think. I know we've done some analysis around about 10 years ago from some film collections, and there wasn't the frying pans in there, but there was certainly other bits in there that shouldn't have been in there, a lot of contamination. So I think the consumer's been maybe on a journey, and things have improved in terms of their thought process, and that was borne out, I think, by the quality of the material we received. So
I wonder if the introduction of film collection at things like supermarkets has also pushed people's views towards the idea of recycling films, and so they're kind of more open to the idea of doing that recycling. So maybe that's affected how, you know, how the participation and how clean the material was through those schemes.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think there's those messages coming out as well. So people have actually been taking materials to supermarkets for some time. So yeah, that embedded behaviour would have developed in that time. So that's a good thought. Just to say, is there any other questions coming through from the chat? I just spotted one more. Just a comment. So we say, presumably lots of fruit and veg packaging, which is fairly clean. Yeah. I think one of the nervousness we had a little bit was about the pet food pouches and how much pet food is going to be remaining in them, because that can smell obviously after a period of time. But it was it wasn't too bad, was it, Veronica? I don't think.
I would say 1 in about 50 maybe bags was like that. Some people were still throwing cat food and smelly bits in there. That obviously the longer they stay in there, the more it's not so pleasant to deal with. However, yeah, overall it wasn't as bad as we thought it would be.
Yeah. Okay. Don't think we have any more questions come through for the moment. Gareth, just from your point of view, is there any sort of final thoughts that you'd like to just to throw in? I know you've covered quite a bit in your presentation, but the challenge for local authorities is quite significant over the next 2-3 years. You know, how you manage that you talked about also some of the debt local authorities are in, having to, you know, sort of comply with regulations. It's a massive step. So your role at LARAC is coming at quite a challenging time.
Yeah, and I think when I sort of took over from Kathy, and Kathy had sort of seen through simpler recycling, and I was moving on to some really exciting subjects like DRS and emissions trading scheme and flexible plastics coming. I was like, I don't know what's going to happen here. And obviously on the back end of that, we've got local government reorganisation coming down the line as well, which, you know, in terms of joining up councils and, you know, making collections and disposal a bit simpler possibly, because it will break it down to smaller chunks. That's still going to come with a big challenge, and I think the message from me for local authorities is that, you know, I think we try and do a good job, and I think most of us do a good job, but we are working in a very different world now, where, you know, unfortunately the voice of local residents, the loudest ones who shout, is the one that gets all the sort of social media and attention. So we're seeing that's particularly with the food waste, you know, some really good messages on food waste going out, but real pushback from residents who are not happy or just want to complain basically. But I think we are now coming out the other side. I'm starting to see sort of like when those negative posts get made on Facebook, for example, actually the other residents jump straight on that person now and quiet that voice down, which is really positive to see. So it's a bit like you weather the storm and actually you get through it at the other end. So my sort of last point really is that as local authorities, we try and do a good job. There is a hell of a lot going on. I worry about the pace of that change. How on earth do you keep up with the pace of all the policy and change that are coming through and actually make good decisions? And I think with the finances, what that's forcing councils to do is to make decisions that actually they make savings short term, but actually don't really take in the fact that actually long term that might be the worst decision, because the long term outlook's not as good as the short term. So I think it's just trying to get that message across that actually looking a bit further ahead than the next sort of 3 or 4 years. You need to really look far ahead. But unfortunately, political cycles and chief execs may not always be in it for the long run. So, you know, the short win, quick win is better in their position than a long sort of term prognosis and trying to fix it for the long term.
Yeah, absolutely right. You've always got that conflict of timescales, haven't you? It's yeah, if a CEO was in place for sort of like 10 years, then you got the contract for 10 years, and you got these fixed cycles, and with the balancing with policy as well, that would be great. But you're not afforded that luxury, unfortunately. Okay. I think that's the questions we've covered off now. If anything else does come up, I know some people are watching this as a recording. Please do feed questions through to the RECOUP team, and we also can liaise with Gareth as well. And if you've got any ideas around what could be included in the next survey, pass that information on to Laura. Her email address was in the chat. Was there any other final comments from yourself, Laura, or Veronica?
No, I think you've covered it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, it's 10:50. You've got 10 minutes back of your day. Take the time to make a nice cup of coffee or tea and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. And
Thank you all.
thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve.